Well, once again, our week-long summer research seminar is going to be started off by Erica Adams. And so, Erica, I'm going to turn things over to you. You can, we'll start in silence, and when you're ready, you can share your screen. And when Erica and Carlota are finished with the presentation, we hopefully will have some time for some worship sharing, which we will do in the spirit of discernment and meeting for worship type setting rather than just sort of an open discussion. But Erica, now it's over to you to start your presentation when you're moved to start.
Okay, since Gray has organized everything, I think I'll just begin with sharing the screen and see, share, and then slideshow.
Erica,
So,
let me just one more thing before you get started, and that my notes to myself. I don't want to take the time to do introductions, much as I wanted to hear from all of you. In lieu of that, I invite you all to put in the chat your name and your monthly and or yearly meeting, just so we have a little more way of associating you with the place and so on. Okay, thank you. And Erica, now over to you.
okay, thank you very much. Okay, I'm doing this talk with Carlota Duarte, who will do the second half of it. And I will try to be very, very brief and won't read so much from the screen as talk, and assume that you can read. I'm from West Falmouth Preparative and Sandwich monthly meetings, and Carlota Duarte is a member of the Society of the Sacred Heart, and she resides in Mexico as a dual US Mexican citizens for the last 30 years. This talk is about agency, public and private space, and follows the format of last year of quarantine, insurrection, and monuments, I think, which has defined our time for the last 17 months. And we're starting with a slide of Piazza Navona in Italy as a public space created in the 15th century. We are adding also our personal artwork to it as artists who started as photographers and also are engaged in works on paper now. Okay, what's not working here? Oh, you have to do this one. I'll say quarantine. Well, these are the facts here, and it was January 9th, 2020, that WHO announced the mysterious coronavirus in Wuhan, China. February 25th, the CDC said we were heading towards a pandemic, and in March 11th, WHO declared a pandemic, and 3 days later, a national emergency was declared by Trump. And we can say through this whole thing that too many people have died. It hasn't been handled well, that very little was known about it, and we're still learning about it, but that we've received vaccines, those of us who think it's important, which seems to be split between Americans and who are Democrats and Americans who are Republicans. And so that speaks to a lot of privilege. And so 41% of the Republicans said no to the vaccine, and 4% of Democrats said no. And so 99.5% of the people who are dying are unvaccinated Americans, and it's spreading. We have Delta, and Lambda is now coming from South America. And we understand that lower ethnic groups, many of whom have to be working during the pandemic, are dying and not getting the vaccine. Okay, let's see. And this is only 23.4% of the world has the COVID vaccine, and you can see the outlay right here. I began doing works on paper in February, and this one, Biogenesis, speaks of kind of material process that I use that has interactions, sometimes eruptive, and this one actually grew mold, and was about my response to what I felt happening in February and March of the dark flow of the pandemic. And so that was what I did at the beginning. And this is what I did at the so-called end of our quarantine, which is float, drift, and flow. So grief describes our sense of loss from the unfamiliar experience of the pandemic of spring 2020. We mourn the loss of our loved ones and of normalcy. In spring 2021, we're languishing adrift in a flattened world of mental fog and endless days in isolation. The antidote to languishing is flow, an elusive state of absorption in a meaningful challenge or a momentary bond where your sense of time melts away. And this is what this was about. Basically, for me, abstraction is focusing on private worlds that often reflect the political climate, but without, for me, the possibility of the polarizing effect of my very political figurative work that I've done most of my life. And I started by doing drawings from music and then overlaying something else on top of it. And this described in April of 2020 how I felt I had lost my moorings. Time was very elastic. I was isolated like most people in quarantine. There was totally uncertain things going on that nobody, including the medical profession, really understood. And then there was an eruption that I talked about last year in Minneapolis, where my brother had moved from St. Paul 5 weeks before, of George Floyd's killing. And I made this in response to that. And I called it Walking to the Beloved, because I did the drawing to one state of watching the news. And then I overlaid it with Sufi mystic music. That's it. And then the kind of feeling of movement happening called traverse or walking. This was in between those two, the beginning and the end, which were quite larger. These are all very small. And the smallness and the panoramic shape allows you not to just focus on one part, but to look all over. And that induces calm and a sense of expansion. I can't say that that was exactly conscious on my part. This is in November and it's called Progression. And you can see animated figures inside of this. It's a bit cartoony and brash. And it's about the idea that we have the knowledge of vaccines by the end of November that are imminent, and some of them are being given to the medical profession. This I did a month ago, 2021, May, June, and it's very textural. I called it Pessoa, which is named after a Portuguese writer who named himself person, and Pessoa in Portuguese is person. So this means all the factual and emotional things that it has to do with being a human being. It's 16 by 16 inches, and it's on a wooden panel. The Insurrection. We all saw these images of people scaling the Capitol. For me, I felt it was like watching the French Revolution. And here on the right-hand side, we have boxes that have been used 1877 for electoral certificates. And this was in the 2020 presidential election, after they'd been removed from the Senate floor on January 6, 2021. Here, scaling the interior of the Senate floor and then taking over all of the seats, including what Pelosi would have. On the right, we see members taking cover from the security of breach, which many people feel. This is yesterday's New York Times did a whole section on this. And I guess you can go back and read this. And basically saying that they've removed from insisting that the mob had stormed the Capitol that day, did nothing wrong, to blame the Democrats for failing to secure the building. So it's not true. So the disinformation, I mean, even people like me start not to believe the New York Times, always reading it skeptically. So where do we live without facts? So monuments. Here on the left, we have Trump supporters posing with Reagan. And here a flag from Gerald Ford hanging off of him. They're interacting with monuments. I think we always interact with monuments, and recently we've been tearing them down. So more pictures. Carlota and I spoke yesterday about the halo that was over this, how people select pictures, and even in newspapers, and all the subtexts that are going on. And I said it was strange how their eyes looked very similar, their mouth looked very similar. And here he's telling Trump to step up to the response of the protesters. And this was the day, I think, that Trump's response to the protests, Twitter described as posing a risk of violence, and they withdrew his ability to use Twitter, which is how he conducted his entire presidency. This is an artist's response. It's in progress. It's a charcoal drawing, very well-known Robert Longo. And Carlota had something to say about this. Basically, we differ on this. She found it taking many different photographs and making a composite, a dishonest kind of thing. But I think Picasso said painting and art is lies I make truth of. And this is, of course, the insurrection on the 6th of January. This was my response to this insurrection. And I do these as a way of meditation, and all of these. And I just follow what comes out. I literally watch my thoughts happen, and I'm not really super aware of what's going on, and maybe only after I've made it. I've been engaged in the idea of polarization since the 1980s. And on the left is a photograph that I made through a pre-Photoshop process that admired the constructed photographic image, and it's called Invented Architecture, Puritan Image. It was specifically around Reagan and the cult of supply side economics that he proposed, that has led to the polarization and income inequality of this country. On the right is what I call a photo sculpture. It's photo etched onto glass. This image on the left, the photograph, this is steel, and then wood. And the idea was that you could only see the picture as such if you sat absolutely in center. And if you move to the right or to the left by 1 degree, the whole image would fall apart. So I guess some people would say the center does not hold. And this is the scale that you can see of these sculptures. These are photo silkscreen on Formica, after the idea that Reagan was our first Teflon president, that everything just rolled off him. And they're meant to be shrines, industrial shrines. And these are different contexts they were shown in. And the facts, so the president won, but he didn't win by much because so many people are so alienated, they don't vote anymore. Monuments, okay, Piazza Navona was defined as a public space in the 15th century. And here from 1651 to 1867, you can see this painting from 1760, that Piazza Navona is flooded. And you see carriages that, of course, only the nobility and the rich could afford. And on the lines here, you see people lined up and leading out of apartments who are not the rich, I assume, watching the whole festivities. And so this was done every August on Saturdays and Sundays. And here's a photograph of this in 1858, which is early for photography. And originally it was a stadium in Dominican Rome, 86 to 96 AD. And on its ruins, the Piazza Navona, which this is how it looks in this July, empty because of the quarantine in Rome, was basically used with many, many fountains. And the idea, I think, of flooding it had to do with cooling, because in August is when the Sirocco, or the desert sands, come from the Sahara of Northern Africa and deposit themselves on the windshields of all the cars. And so it's quite hot there. It's oppressively hot. And this is one of the many fountains that still fill this. I've never seen any damage to this, but on that note, I think most of us remember when La Pieta by Michelangelo in Sistine Chapel was destroyed, or not destroyed, harmed by someone with a sledgehammer. In Minneapolis, this was from last year. It's probably one of the most iconic images from that time. And I spoke with my brother who lives in this neighborhood, and the police station will probably be built by 2023, rebuilt. The post office is questionable. And the Minneapolis mayor made a very important decision. I think he's a former, civil rights lawyer. And Jacob Frey and the police chief decided that having officers stand the ground in the police station last year was the wrong idea, and it wasn't worth the potential loss of life to save the building. And if that meant writing the tactical playbook of American policing, then they said, so be it. And so this was a departure from the norm and probably studied for many years. This was an image on the right from Facebook where my brother's friends and had identified somebody who was dressed strangely and had a sledgehammer, and was later identified as one of the 100 people that were arrested, 99 of which were associated with white racist and white supremacist groups. And that's it for that. And of course, we saw the projections on the monuments. And this was in Virginia. It was Robert E. Lee and the festivities that took us afterwards. I think this is interaction with monuments for sure. This was what I call Provisional Monuments. This is June 18th, 2020. And this was put up at that time. It wasn't known who put that up. And this is what we're talking about basically today. On June 19th, 2020, very shortly afterwards, there was a Juneteenth commemoration in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where people congregated, where George Floyd was killed by police officers and died. And this is August 5th. And one of the memorials put up, I think Provisional Monuments, was a painting by a Minneapolis native of George Floyd's face. And it was called George Perry Floyd Jr. Place. It was recommended by the Minneapolis Planning Commission in August 2020 that it be called that. And they allocated $4.7 million to establish a permanent memorial at the site in the Minneapolis 2040 zoning plan. And this is what happened. There's a comment, and basically it's an architect who writes about architecture, in particular presentation, and he was very interested in this. And he said, but none of the artistic outpouring was ever meant to be permanent. And most of historic preservation, and this is a critique, he's not endorsing it, it's a critique. In preservation's interpretive structure stems directly from 19th century European practices in museum curation and art historiography. And a century later, we're still organizing everything on artifacts and objects predefined by cultures of origin, artist styles, and subjective judgments of artistic excellence. This is one of the many reasons why until recently, we've had so little interpretation of Native American sites and long erased stories, or we could say suppressed stories. So his question is, how can the design and preservation communities share these artworks and their messages long after they're gone? And this is what he wrote in July 2020. Okay, this is January 18th on MLK Day, 2021 in George Floyd Square. And the artist replaced what was originally a wooden plywood statue with a metal one, and they wanted it to be a permanent thing. So this had been there for almost a year when they did this, of course. And this is the artist. This is what it looks like. And in early December, knowing they would replace this, they had an open hand because this is a closed Black Power salute fist. And he said it's supposed to represent the power of the people It's the people who made it happen. We all take very special to our hearts, and we're able to participate this way. It's a protest as a community. We come together to protest. These were other I think, monuments, a sign referencing a list of demands. Mayor Frey in February 12th announces plans to reopen the intersection after a conclusion of the Chauvin trial. And he said it will be an important gathering spot during that time, and that it would never return to normal. That the legacy of the protest movement started with his death will be there recognized permanently. And in March, protesters gathered and insisted it remain closed and posted their list of 24 demands. You can find that online. And this was another short-lived thing called Save Your Minds. I consider it a kind of monument of all the hundreds headstones of people killed by law enforcement, Black people primarily. And this is May 25th, a 1-year anniversary of George Floyd's murder, where it happened, 2021. And this is June 3rd. Mayor Frey decided that complaints from neighbors trapped in their homes, business owners with diminished access, spikes in crime and traffic flow caused a need to reopen the intersection that was essential for the city. He talked about reconnecting the city, a commitment to equity citywide, and an investment in the neighborhood. Okay, 2021, June 19th, on Juneteenth, unveiled in New York, in New Jersey, at City Hall, was this oversized monument or statue to George Floyd, giving, like a number of actually monuments across the United States have given places for people to sit down next to the revered person. And this went up again on June 19th, 2021 in Newark. And on June 19th, also unveiled in Brooklyn, was this head made of wood. And here's the brother of George Floyd talking. And only days later, it was vandalized, and so was the other monument that I just showed you. And this one's again in Brooklyn. In more private art that's still public, there was this in 2018, I saw at the Museum of Contemporary Art, or Mass MoCA, by Titus Kapar, The Language of Forgotten. And it's in this box type structure and backlit with light. And it's in glass, and it's a photo etched, I think, or printed. And it's the lover of African-American lover, Sally Hemings, who bore him many children, of Thomas Jefferson. This is a proposed monument for San Francisco in 2022 in the summer. This is the artist Cheryl DeCote. They call them designers now because it's constructed by other people. And essentially it's a Harriet Tubman memorial, and it's all in glass, and it'll be a photograph, historic photograph. And this structure, which I find a bit strange, but whatever. She said she's doing it in these panels in case something gets broken, it can be replaced. And she was impressed by these as a young artist growing up. And this one is Mary Mcleod Bethune, a world-renowned educator, civil rights leader, and women's activist, presidential advisor, and public service servant. In 1935, she founded the National Council of Women. And this one was a response to Maya Lin's abstract monument of like a V shape that went into the ground for the Vietnam Memorial. And these were a reaction and meant to convey something for people who need figurative art and not abstract art. And they made a big, serious approach to make sure that it had European American, African American, and Latino American that was consistent with who went to Vietnam. And that was in 1984. So monuments have toppled, And this one's still there. It's in contention. And this one was beheaded, the Christopher Columbus in Boston. And this actually was factual. When a leader leads his army or into battle, everybody else walks except the leader who was on a horse of that time. But we don't understand that now. So we find this abhorrent as a people now, as a general thing, that these people would be walking, that he's white, that this person's a Native American and this person's African American. So this may come down yet. This is Carlota Duarte, and now she will do her part. And I've been happy to work with her for over 20 years. We've curated a show together. I've done workshops in Chiapas where I've been 3 times. And I will just say that she was active in Boston for many years and recently headed a collaborative art project known as the Chiapas Photography Project in Mexico since 1992. She has an MFA from Rhode Island School of Design, and her photographs and paintings have been exhibited and published in US, Mexico, and Iceland. She's taught at the University of Lowell. She's lectured and curated. Her book, Odella, A Hidden Survivor, was published in 1990. She's a dual national and a member of the Society of the Sacred Heart and International Order of Nuns. I think I have to back out of this now. Is that right?
So
How does this work?
Carlota is going to be speaking from this as well. Carla, do you have this open on your computer as well to share?
Yes, but I don't have the facility of changing the slides.
Okay, then I can do that. I mean, if you can't do that.
Okay. So I'll just say in terms of other things that I've been engaged with academically, which is of interest, I think, to some of those participants today who are academics or have a history of research and so on. After I started my work in Chiapas, within 3 years, I was invited to be a visiting researcher at an academic research center, which focus has pretty much been mostly the social sciences. But there was interest on the part of the mostly anthropologists in what I was doing, which was to, and continues to be, giving Indigenous people access to photography so that they could speak, so we could say, of their own lives rather than outside people, representing them in images. So that was another part of my, and I was 16 years, I think it is, at the research center. First, I was just as an affiliate, so to speak, and then I was tenured. So that's the only other thing I would add. In terms of things here, some of my, apart from my formal studies in art, from the time I was a child, I've been engaged with making things of all sorts. And also formal research in 1988 was part of a research and publication project funded by the NEH for about Mexican picture collections, Mexican image collections, not just photographs, anything, paintings, drawings, graphics, even those things of monuments. That could be another thing of things like archaeological sites, but in image form. And to produce a reference book, because of the limitation of access to information, visual information from Mexico, the person who came up with the idea as a picture researcher found that she was drawing on US collections of Mexican imagery. So they were already edited or selected from bigger collections, and she felt that was unbalanced. So she had originated this idea, and I joined her for the research and the putting together of the book, associate editor, and I also designed the cover. So that was a very formative for me. My father was Mexican from Yucatan, and although I was raised in the US with not too much consciousness or not too often, other than as being bicultural or as being biracial, other than people being confused by my name because I'm pretty white in color. And that was like, what is that name kind of thing? But you don't look it. And if I said, well, it's a Mexican name and whatever, oh, but you don't look it. So maybe that meant I passed and it was okay with people. I don't know, but that has happened to me. So that was a very fundamental experience that I had that bore fruit, really, or what would I say, was in my consciousness, unconsciousness, subconsciousness for several years before it became conscious of what I had learned, one of the many things I'd learned in 1992 when I started the Chiapas Photography Project. My background started, my formal work in public of showing my work was principally with photographs. And this is a book about a woman who lives in the south end of Boston, where I lived, moved there with a group of our nuns to be available to the neighborhood of low-income Latino people there in Boston South End, which is now very, very gentrified, except for the island of mostly Latino people in one part of the South End. But we went there to just be available to see what service we might offer, as we are educators is our mission. And out of that came a number of community-based activities. But one of the things that, for me, was meeting this woman who was a deinstitutionalized woman of Native American and Dutch background, who was released from after 30 years in Massachusetts mental hospitals. She was one of our neighbors, and as many of our neighbors, she would come to the house to use the telephone. Very few people in our neighborhood had, almost no one, I think, on our particular block had a phone. And so she was among those people, and I met her there. And she knew that I had just begun, after I moved to that neighborhood, begun taking photographs of my Latino neighbors. So she said, well, why don't you take my picture? So I did, and then gave her the prints, as I did with the other people. But anyway, she said, oh, why don't you come to my own place where I could be more myself? So she said she wanted me to be her photographer. And I said, oh, fine. And she lived one block away. So I went, and she would tell me when she wanted me to come. She said, I'm ready. And so I'd get there, and she'd have her costumes and so on. And I made prints, of course, and gave them to her. What intrigued me about this as an experience as a human being and my interaction with this other human being is that whole question of how one sees oneself. I would take photographs of her, then I would develop them and print them in my darkroom. And it was often difficult for me to look at some of the images. They felt painful to me. They felt full of suffering. And I knew her story. I knew she had suffered a great deal. But nonetheless, when I would give the prints to her, she thought they were fabulous. This shows me looking beautiful, looking powerful, looking glamorous. And so I became very intrigued by that notion of who speaks for whom. And so developed this as a project, trying to formalize it, and later continued on that when I was at Rhode Island School of Design. And then a number of years later it was published, but I started tape recording her comments, looking at the photographs of how she saw herself, so that the outside viewer can really have a conversation with her, both visual and in text. So that was a very significant part of my being in that neighborhood and giving form through my artistic medium to the reality of one particular person who is very much an individual person, but who could certainly represent any number of people or reflect the concerns and the suffering of any number of people. So this gives you some idea of the, pretty much all of them taken in her house, her apartment. And then that show traveled to a few different places. It traveled to several places in the US. And here it is, it was in Mexico City. On the right, it was at a gallery in Mexico City, and the other is in San Cristobal, where it was shown in a very old building. I don't know how old it actually is, maybe 450 years. But anyway, so it has been circulated and certainly gained a degree of recognition, not just for this person, but of the kind of suffering, I think, that individuals, and yet their inherent human dignity. And it was widely covered, and that particular image of her holding the I think it's Richard Avedon book about Marilyn Monroe, which I think someone gave me, and she saw it and she said, "Oh, I want this book." So I gave it to her, and she started posing, herself based on the images. So then this is kind of the another project that was going on at the same time with my neighbors, as I mentioned. My first week there, 2 or 3 days, first of all, it was like, what have I done moving to this neighborhood, which was very frightening to me. I'd never lived in a neighborhood like that. Very high crime and whatever. But in any case, the other nuns had been there a couple of years, and they said, don't worry, you will become very much at home here and so on, which in fact I did. But in any case, so to relate to the people, I went out and offered to take photographs of them. It was like, I think it was a late summer day when I started, people sitting out on their stoops. And I took pictures and then I gave them to the people, and they were pleased. And then they started inviting me into their homes where they wanted to present themselves, similar to Odella, present themselves in their living rooms or in other ways, or to their events, weddings and other kinds of things. And so I did that for quite a number of years. And then I moved out of the neighborhood, stayed in touch with the people themselves, but stayed in touch with a neighborhood which was undergoing radical change. The particular group of people, it was called or a part of the effort for housing, the Emergency Tenants Council, was a group of local people in Boston trying to address the terrible housing situation in Boston, not just the lack of it, but the conditions. And part of that it started. In fact, the house in which we lived, the nuns lived, was used as a meeting place. And we had a car. Most people didn't have cars, and we had a VW van. And so we would take people down to meetings at City Hall and other places to assist them in this effort for housing, which bore very significant fruit in that finally they were given, they had their own organization that came out of these efforts and received the first HUD money for a Latino neighborhood. It was very significant and very recognized in the New York Times and other places for this very significant victory. So I stayed with that project, but when the construction started, I was visiting the neighborhood and talking with people and how encouraged and hopeful they were. And then I realized that, how many years had passed, quite a few since the first photo. So I offered to take more recent photos when they had settled in their new homes. But before that, I took pictures of some of the construction and so on. And then when they moved into their homes, I visited some of them again. And so we had photos from earlier and later years, and the demolition of the old buildings, a whole range of activities. And I was engaged in the neighborhood in other ways. I had a program for elderly people. One of the buildings in the new complex is for senior citizens, and I had offered art classes for seniors. So I was still engaged in the neighborhood, but not living on the block where I had initially started there. But the project itself, I showed it, a plan to share it with the neighborhood in their own cultural center, which they had remodeled a church to create a cultural center. And someone at the Institute of Contemporary Art in Boston saw the show and invited me to have the show at the Institute of Contemporary Art, and for me to act as a curator to include other photographers working within neighborhoods, not outsiders going in, but people who actually lived in neighborhoods. So I put together a show at the ICA, and it was quite well received. This was in 1992. And I was glad to have done it. And this shows you some views of the ICA in its previous location, remodeled what do you call it? Fire station. My work was all in laminate. Each image was laminated and they were linked together so they could be interacted with. And in the neighborhood where it was first shown, the cultural center, no one had a problem picking up these chains of photographs, touching and handling them, pulling them across to show somebody or whatever. At the ICA, no one would touch them because it was an art context. And so they had to sign up saying you may touch the pieces. It was quite interesting. The other images of the other persons, other photographers within four or five other neighborhoods were more conventionally mounted. But it was a very, very good experience for me to do and to conclude my engagement with the community. But also overlapping that, some of the, moving, but when that actually ended, I started my work in Mexico, which we'll touch on later. But I also developed or worked with other notions of community and sense of place and my own interior life as an artist. I'm a religious person, so that my interior life is extremely important to me and giving form in some way. So I ended up doing some other photographic works. Here are two pieces from 97. But they are what we call in art talk, we call constructed images. They're not just what I see or one could see in front of one's eyes. It's really putting things together, arranging things and taking a photograph. So that's what these two are. And I also moved into other media or returned to other media, which I had worked with many years earlier in some of these, again, some of it parallel. This is the previous one is the shape of the Yucatan Peninsula, where my father was from, where I visited and reconnected and met family members in the early 80s. But I did a series, and these also were shown actually in the ICA several years earlier than the Villa Victoria Latino neighborhood. But it's, repetition of a map shape, incorporating some fragments of language, of written text. And then I moved to doing a similar, maybe 5-7 years later, did a similar 40 drawings of the state of Chiapas, which is down next to the Guatemala border. It's the other border of Mexico, not the north with the US, but the south with Guatemala. And so I again entered into working with other media in terms of my sense of place, of being in a place, its history, and so on. And it was a similar kind of activity in using a predetermined shape and simply interpreting it in a range of ways. And then the text sort of emerged unto itself in a curious kind of unexpected way. And again, all this work is not done in consistency. Okay, I'm finishing a project tomorrow, I start something else. I don't work that way. Often there are lulls when I do absolutely nothing. And especially with the project, the Indigenous photography project that I started, I did not want to require of myself or expect that I would do my personal art while I was helping the Indigenous people develop their photographic skills, because I did not want to either feel my own work was impinging on what I was hoping to do with the Indigenous people, or that that I did not want to resent that what I was doing with them was preventing me from doing my own work. So I decided at the very beginning, I wouldn't do anything. By chance, I ended up doing work over the years, but not because I had placed a requirement on myself that I must do my personal work. And anyway, after a lull of, I don't know, a couple of years of doing probably nothing, one day it's kind of a mystery to me, but I started, I've learned a great deal about Indigenous Maya culture here, the Chiapas, various ethnic groups in the state, and work directly with them and so on. But a part of very integral to their lives is spiritual practice and relationship with the natural world, ritual, all of that. And so I have found, well, it's a pretty long and complicated story, and I won't go into that, but my interest in their active lives are things that I could see, things they were showing me and everyone through their photographs, and about their interior life and the things that were meaningful to them and the form it took. And so I started writing prayers. The first image we saw was 3 very small books of the Psalms. I wrote out all the Psalms, all 150 Psalms, in simply pencil on paper, but writing it in a form that of weaving, where the text is overlapping or woven in lines and then other directions, and sometimes diagonally, because the intention was not that this was something to read, but something to enter into, something of what the Psalms are for me and for anyone, perhaps. And part of what's important to me about my work, most of it's very small scale, is it's to invite contemplation, of spending time with the piece and let it speak back. So in this case, one could look at a page and it looks like, oh dear, what is this? As you spend time with it, text can emerge for you. So I started doing that. Of course, I come from the Judeo-Christian tradition, and this exercise or activity prompted me to look into others. And so here is an Islamic prayer, the 99 names of Allah. And I found online, I found a transcribed text so that I could write it out. So I didn't have to learn the Arabic alphabet. And this too, these are books, these all fold up. Many of these drawings, they fold up into very small, they're sort of like private prayer books, kind of things one could carry with one, that were very common in Christianity. Small texts, portable. And so that's what these come from. It's the same thing. Then I moved beyond that. I became more, things that influence. I started interest in looking for indigenous prayers that were written down. Where I am, Maya people, it's largely an oral tradition. And most people, in fact, are not even literate in their first language or in Spanish. But I did have found a number of transcribed prayers, a good many of them, probably most, relating to agricultural activities related to corn and principally corn and the different steps and dealing with corn harvesting and all sorts of things, corn fields. So then I started working with that, writing out these texts, these prayer texts, but incorporating pigment. But the pigment is soil from the communities. So, and it's simply soil applied to paper. It's not, I don't have a binder, and the particular paper I'm using is it's a Spanish watercolor paper, and it works quite well at absorbing the soils, which I apply in liquid form or kind of mud or whatever, and let them sit up and then brush them off. I discovered pretty interestingly, relatively recently, that the paper I was using is from Spain. It's the one that works the best of all that I've experimented with. And, Spain conquered these lands. And so I'm sort of, bringing and connecting Spain again with the original peoples in a curious kind of way. But each piece is based, and you see the 3 on the right rather, have been made into topographical. So they're 3-dimensional, part of the process I've developed. After they're finished, I soak them in water. And then I drape them over a material to give them a topographical feel. Okay, Erica. Okay, this is, to conclude these next couple of images, this is about the importance of a result, an artistic expression of the success of the Latino community in getting housing. On the right is a close view of a clay mural done by, was done in 79 by Boston artist Lily Ann Rosenberg with children. She had already been working in the neighborhood in an arts program and was very engaged and supportive of the Latino success. So she was, I don't know what the word, commissioned to do this project. On the left is a fuller view of it. It commemorates Betances, who was a Puerto Rican patriot for independence from Spain. In the background of the image on the left, you can see the housing for senior citizens. The other buildings in the complex are based on the style of the Boston South End row houses. And the architect, in fact, got an award for how he engaged that style, but with a touch of for whom it was serving, which is a story unto itself. Okay, here's a little bit about Betances. He was a doctor as well as a activist, and extremely important in emancipation of slaves and independence from Spain. Okay, this is a project I do in Mexico where indigenous people themselves take the photographs, and we have published books and did a portfolio of selection of some of the images, and have created traveling exhibitions, one about respect for religious differences, which is been traveling around. Eric has been instrumental in having that travel in the US. We also have traveled it in Mexico. And we've had hundreds of participants over the years in a range of ways, including some children. But the project is for adults, so they are given the autonomy and don't have, they themselves can give permission for use of their photos and so on. Copyright belongs to them. Here's a few more images from some recent projects. Groups might form in a particular village and decide they want to have a group of women document or take photos of what they're weaving, which is very fundamental in terms of they're making their own clothing and so on. And celebrations, the right side men in red are in a particular community for one of their ritual activities. And this moves into the topic Erica introduced earlier of monuments. And in the monument in San Cristobal, a few months, 2 months before, no, 1 month before I arrived here to start the actual work in '92, was the statue of the man, or two men, but the statue was of one of them, Mazariegos, who was one of the founders of the city. And a statue was taken down around, it was the 500th anniversary of Columbus. And it was kind of a preview of what would happen 2 years later when we had an indigenous uprising by a group that's become known as the Zapatistas. So this is a public monument that has not been replaced. The base has been removed. And it was an indigenous people who, with support of others, and here it was, they took it down, they beheaded him. And you can see indigenous people who were part of this important activity. And this is a Zapatista mural up in their own area. They have a section of the state which is really under their authority. This photo was taken by Erica in 2013. An interesting feature, next. Here we have Mexico City, the empty pedestal on the left of Cristobal Colon, which the city government knew would probably be attacked. It also was in serious need of repair, so it was removed last year. And it's being refurbished. Where it will go is unknown at present, if it will be replaced there or not. There are others that show in Mexico, public space, as in many countries, is monuments, often of figures. And there's one of Cuauhtemoc, who was one of the indigenous leaders, Aztec leader, that is included with, and right next to the conqueror. An interesting feature of Mexican life, civic life, is there are intentional spaces for public gatherings for purposes of protest and celebration. And it's intentional. It's big open spaces, plazas and whatever. And it's not where people have to take to the streets. They're given space. And it's very striking and commonly used for all kinds of things, celebrations as well as protests of all kinds. And it's quite different because it's acknowledged that there has to be public space for people to speak in other forms, not through formalities of government negotiation or something. And then this one that Erica found, which is pretty striking and very hopeful, a very hopeful note to end this presentation on, of an Indigenous woman with a quilt based on, reflecting cultural features of clothing and so on, up near the Pipestone National, it's called the Pipestone National Monument, but it has been, recognized as very important to commemorate the reality of Indigenous culture, history, land, and other things, and done in a very monumental style. You can see the scale of it. It's very large. And I think it's a very hopeful kind of thing that's happened in the US, in my observation, from not in the US, from a view from outside, of an increased recognition, even this land acknowledgement gesture, which I see as a beginning of what I would hope to be restitution, not just acknowledgement, as very important, and speaks to the potential of all of us, I think, to do good and not ill. So I will end on that note. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Carlota. It was a pleasure.